Thank you for joining us today on KZSU Stanford 90.1 FM for our 5-minute technology news update. We would like today to congratulate Stanford Professor Emeritus Martin Hellman and consulting scholar Whitfield Diffie because they were recently awarded the 2015 Turing Award for their contribution to modern cryptography. We are very honored that Professor Martin Hellman gave KZSU this interview.
Back in the mid-'70s, two students of mine, Whit Diffie and Ralph Merkle, and I invented what's called public key cryptography. And while people may not have heard of that, every time you buy something on the internet with a credit card, every time you do electronic banking, anytime you get that little lock on the browser, which you may notice, that's using that technology. And before public key cryptography, if you and your bank wanted to talk securely, you had to send them a registered letter ahead of time with the key. But what we came up with is something that seems impossible. With no prearrangement, your bank's computer and your computer talk back and forth and very quickly establish a secret key that even though it's a public protocol, everyone knows how it's being done, and someone might be listening to the whole conversation, they're unable to understand what you're saying. It sounds impossible, and in one sense it is, but it turns out from an important sense it is possible.
Could you tell us the interesting story about the patents for public key cryptography?
Stanford filed for patents, and the inventors, it varied from patent to patent, but basically Whit Diffie, Ralph Merkle, and myself. Interestingly, Stanford and we made almost no money off of our patents, whereas three guys at MIT, Ravesh, Shamir, and Adelman, known as RSA, formed a company that they sold for $250 million and never paid us any royalties. They credited us in their paper with inventing public key cryptography. And I admit that it's a different thing to give credit in an academic paper versus paying royalties. And there were some weaknesses in the way our patent was written because Stanford had a summer intern, a law student, write the first patent, among other things. But that's in the past, and I'm actually very good friends now. I wasn't for a while, but I'm good friends with RSA and the former president of their company, Jim Bidzos. So life's worked out well.
What advice would you give people who are trying to patent an invention today?
A patent on an invention is only as good economically if it's written really well and if you have enough money to defend it. I sometimes joke that we have the best legal system in the United States that money can buy. And if you have a small budget and your opponent has a large budget, you're likely to lose no matter how right your cause. And I remember, in fact, a conversation with Stanford's outside patent attorney when we were trying to get RSA, Data Security as the company was called, to pay royalties. And the patent attorney, now deceased, Al Test, he was one of the great patent attorneys in Silicon Valley, said to Director of Technology Licensing at the time, Niels Reimers, unless you can give me $250,000 budget and to put it up for inflation and everything else, that's like $1 million budget today or more. Unless you can give me that budget, don't go near challenging them because you find yourself, you spend a little bit and then you find yourself getting in more and more. And so unless you can give me at least that budget, don't touch it. And Stanford didn't have that kind of budget at that point in time. The technology was not clearly worth a lot, and technology licensing at Stanford was in its early days. Another thing, a patent's good for roughly 20 years from data filing. And which would you rather have? Would you rather have 20 years of patents on the invention of the automobile engine, basically, the internal combustion engine, or would you rather have a patent today on an improvement that gets 5% better gas mileage? The second patent is much less seminal, much less important in many ways than the first, but because it took decades to build an industry based on the internal combustion engine, the second patent would be worth billions, whereas the first patent was almost worthless. And we had the same problem. We came up with what's called a seminal invention, a really major break, and it takes a long time to build an industry.
Did you remain involved with cryptography since then?
That invention was 1976, roughly, and starting in 1981, my interest shifted from cryptography, or today we'd call it cybersecurity, to the bigger issues of the world, war and peace, nuclear weapons, how fallible human beings are going to survive having godlike physical power. Like in the Bible, only God's supposed to be able to destroy civilization, whereas human beings can do that today.
Thank you for joining us today on KZSU Stanford 90.1 FM. We would also like to thank Professor Martin Hellman very much for this interview. And everyone at KZSU would like to congratulate Professor Martin Hellman for being honored with the Turing Award. If you would like a copy of today's broadcast, please download it from our website, ModernTekNews.com. That's ModernTekNews.com. And please follow the link to Technology News.